Officer Daniel Briggs had just graduated from the police academy, and the pride in his chest felt as heavy as the shiny new badge on his uniform. He was only 24 years old, but in his own mind, he was already one of the best. The academy had trained him in the law, self-defense, and the importance of order. But somewhere along the way, Daniel had developed an ego that seemed bigger than his sense of duty. As he walked through the glass doors of the courthouse for the first time, his boots made a sharp tapping sound on the marble floor. He liked the way it echoed. It made him feel important. The morning sun streamed in through tall windows, highlighting the gold buttons on his dark blue uniform. People noticed him as he passed, but it wasn't because they were impressed. Most were just curious about the young officer walking with such a swagger. Daniel believed those glances were admiration, and it fed his confidence. In his mind, he was no longer just Daniel Briggs from a small neighborhood. He was Officer Briggs, someone with power. He adjusted his duty belt and glanced at his reflection in the polished courthouse glass. He didn't see a rookie with much to learn. He saw someone who could command a room. In his mind, judges, lawyers, and even other police officers would have to respect him because of the badge he wore. The quiet halls of the courthouse seemed to welcome him, but in reality, they were simply unaware of the storm about to arrive. Daniel's assignment that day was simple: appear in court as a witness for a case involving an arrest he had made. It should have been a routine process, the kind of thing most officers handle without drama. But Daniel didn't see it that way. He thought of it as a chance to show everyone in the courtroom just how capable, confident, and sharp he was. He imagined himself answering questions with the precision of a seasoned officer, impressing the jury and earning nods from the attorneys. In his head, this was his stage. He spotted a few senior officers near the courtroom entrance and walked toward them. They nodded politely, but he mistook their polite reserve for quiet respect. What Daniel didn't realize was that they could sense something about him, something restless, maybe even reckless. They had all been rookies once, and they knew confidence could be a good thing, but arrogance? That could lead to trouble. Inside the courthouse buzzed with quiet activity. Lawyers shuffled through stacks of papers, clerks tapped on keyboards, and family members whispered anxiously in the waiting area. Daniel barely noticed any of it. He was focused on himself, how he looked, how he walked, how he would speak. Every move felt like a performance. When a bailiff passed by, Daniel gave him a short nod, the kind that was supposed to communicate mutual respect. The bailiff returned the gesture, but his eyes lingered on Daniel for a moment, perhaps sensing that this young officer had a lot to learn about the difference between confidence and arrogance. The minutes ticked by, and Daniel checked his watch impatiently. He didn't like waiting. He thought being an officer meant people moved on his time. The longer he stood there, the more his mind wandered, and the more he convinced himself that the courtroom needed someone like him, someone bold, unafraid to speak up, unafraid to challenge authority if necessary. He ran through possible scenarios. In his mind, what if the defense attorney tried to trip him up with tricky questions? He pictured himself smiling calmly, delivering the perfect answer that would leave the lawyer speechless. What if the judge interrupted him? He imagined holding his ground politely but firmly, making it clear that he knew his rights and his role to Daniel. This wasn't just another day on the job, it was the beginning of his rise. But beneath all that confidence was something dangerous. A refusal to see the difference between courage and disrespect. He had no idea that in just a short while he would be face to face with someone who had more authority, more experience, and far more control than he could ever imagine. The doors to the courtroom finally opened, and Daniel stepped inside. The air felt cooler, the atmosphere heavier. A large seal of the state hung behind the judge's bench, and rows of polished wooden pews filled the space. In the front, a black woman in judicial robes sat reviewing papers. Her presence was calm, but powerful. And Daniel knew instantly that this was Judge Margaret Hayes. He didn't think of her as someone to respect. He saw her as just another person in the system, someone who would hear his words and be impressed by his professionalism. But in reality, this was a woman with decades of legal experience, a sharp mind, and a courtroom reputation that could silence even the most stubborn lawyer. Daniel's boots echoed again as he walked toward the witness stand, and for a moment he felt that same thrill he had felt when he first stepped into the courthouse. The young officer had no idea that his attitude, his overconfidence, and his unwillingness to back down were about to collide with Judge Hayes' authority in a way that would change the course of his career and his life forever. What Daniel didn't realize was that the real test of his day wasn't about proving his strength or showing off his knowledge. It was about learning the kind of respect that can't be demanded with a badge, it has to be earned. And that lesson, though he didn't know it yet, was coming sooner than he could imagine. The day had barely begun, yet the air inside the courthouse was already thick with the quiet tension of legal battles waiting to unfold. After checking in with the clerk, Officer Daniel Briggs was handed the case file he would be testifying for. It was a criminal case, one that had stirred whispers in the police department and attracted more than a little public attention. A young man had been arrested under questionable circumstances, and Daniel was the arresting officer. The file said this was a high-profile proceeding. Due to the involvement of community leaders and media interest, Daniel saw it differently. To him, this wasn't just about lit. It was about showing everyone in the room that he was the kind of officer who couldn't be intimidated. As he skimmed the details, he noticed something that made his lips curl into a half-smile. The judge presiding over the case was none other than Judge Margaret Hayes. The name was familiar, though not because Daniel had ever been in her courtroom before. She was known throughout the city as a symbol of strength, one of the first black women to serve as a judge in the state, with a career that spanned more than 2 decades. Lawyers described her as brilliant, fair, and utterly unshakable. The police officers who had testified before her often said she could read a witness like an open book. But Daniel wasn't impressed by reputation. If anything, it made him more determined to hold his ground. In his mind, judges were just part of the machinery of the system, important, yes, but not beyond challenge. He convinced himself that if she questioned him too hard, he would respond firmly. He wasn't going to let anyone, not even a respected judge, make him look weak. As the minutes passed, Daniel replayed the arrest in his head. The case had been messy. The suspect had claimed his rights were violated, and the defense was expected to hammer on that point. Daniel told himself that his testimony would crush those claims. He wasn't nervous of anything. He was eager. This was his stage. When the bailiff finally called his case, Daniel stood tall, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the double doors of the courtroom. The sound of those heavy doors opening was like the first act of a play. Inside, the room was already filling with spectators. Some were there for their own cases. Others seemed to be watching out of curiosity. A few reporters sat quietly with notepads in hand. Judge Hayes was already seated at the bench, her dark robe draped elegantly over her shoulders. Her expression was calm, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that made it clear she missed nothing. She was scanning through a thick folder of documents, her pen tapping lightly against the desk. Daniel noticed the way people looked at her lawyers, spoke with measured respect. The clerk addressed her with deference, and even the bailiff seemed extra precise in his movements. It didn't intimidate him. Instead, it made him think. So everyone here treats her like she's untouchable. Let's see how she handles me. When their eyes met briefly, Daniel gave a polite nod, but there was a trace of smugness in it. Judge Hayes didn't respond in kind. She simply continued reviewing the file. It wasn't rudeness, it was control. She wasn't there to exchange pleasantries. The prosecuting attorney motioned for Daniel to take the witness stand. As he walked across the room, he noticed the defense attorney watching him closely, already sizing him up. He took the oath with a steady voice, though there was an undercurrent of arrogance in the way he said, "I do." From the start, it was clear Daniel intended to speak with authority, to dominate the narrative. His answers were confident, perhaps too confident, brushed with an air of certainty that left little room for humility. He emphasized his own decisions during the arrest, often slipping in small comments about his training and judgment. At first, Judge Hayes listened without interruption. She let the questioning proceed, but she occasionally glanced at Daniel over the rim of her glasses. It wasn't the look of someone impressed. It was the look of someone carefully weighing whether the witness understood the responsibility of being under oath. Daniel didn't notice. He was too focused on appearing in control, too busy performing for the audience in his mind. He didn't see the subtle tightening of the judge's jaw when he interrupted the prosecutor to clarify a point in a way that seemed more like a lecture than an answer. He was about to learn that this courtroom didn't belong to him. And in here, authority wasn't worn, it was earned. What Daniel didn't realize was that every word, every tone, and every interruption was being measured. And Judge Hayes' patience had limits. And those limits he was already testing. The moment questioning began, Daniel Briggs made it clear without saying it outright that he wasn't there to simply answer questions. He was there to make a statement. The prosecuting attorney started with routine inquiries where he was stationed that day, how he encountered the suspect, and what led to the arrest. Daniel responded in crisp, confident sentences, but each answer carried a subtle edge as he were the smartest person in the room. He leaned forward in the witness chair, shoulders squared, speaking just a little louder than necessary, his voice carrying across the courtroom like a declaration rather than a testimony. The defense attorney took note, scribbling something on a legal pad. The jurors exchanged a few glances, some curious, some skeptical. Judge Hayes sat silently, watching him over her reading glasses, her fingers folded neatly on the bench. She had presided over hundreds of cases and seen every kind of witness. The nervous, the defensive, the hostile. But there was something about Daniel, something that went beyond confidence into the dangerous territory of defiance. It started small. The prosecutor asked a simple follow-up question. Instead of answering directly, Daniel smirked and said, "I think it's pretty obvious, but sure, I'll explain it again." A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. That tone, half sarcasm, half arrogance, wasn't common in this courtroom, especially not toward the attorneys. Judge Hayes' eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing yet. She knew when to let her rope unspool. Then the defense attorney began cross-examination, and Daniel's attitude sharpened. When she challenged his version of events, he interrupted mid-question, saying, "No, that's not how it happened at all. If you'd been there, you'd know better." His voice wasn't angry, but it was loaded with condescension, the kind that suggested he didn't take her question seriously. The judge's gavel came down lightly. "Officer Briggs," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You will let counsel finish before responding." "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel replied. But the way he said it was more like, "Yeah, sure, whatever you say." Within minutes, he did it again. The defense attorney asked, "Isn't it true that you approached my client before confirming his description matched the suspect?" Daniel didn't just answer. He leaned back in his chair and said, "I don't think you understand how police work actually operates." There was a pause. The room went still. All eyes turned to Judge Hayes. She removed her glasses and fixed him with a level stare that could freeze a rushing river. "Officer Briggs," she said slowly, "you are here to answer questions, not to critique counsel. Do I make myself clear?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable weight. Still, Daniel's expression didn't change much. "Yes, Your Honor," he repeated, but his tone was the same measured, polite on the surface, yet dripping with an unspoken challenge. What Daniel failed to realize was that in this room, respect wasn't optional. Every time he spoke over someone, every time he laced his words with sarcasm, he was pressing against the invisible boundaries of courtroom decorum. Boundaries that Judge Hayes had no intention of letting him cross without consequence. As cross-examination continued, the tension thickened. Daniel began answering questions with extra detailed tales that weren't asked for, clearly trying to take control of the narrative. It wasn't just about telling his side. It was about proving, in his own mind, that he knew better than the judge, the attorneys, and perhaps even the law itself. For the spectators, it was becoming uncomfortable to watch. It was like seeing someone poke at a sleeping lion, unaware, perhaps unwilling to believe that the lion could pounce at any second. Judge Hayes, however, was patient. She let the exchanges play out, making careful mental notes. But there was a quiet steel in her eyes now, a certainty that this officer was heading for a lesson. He would not forget. Daniel thought he was winning the room with his confidence. In truth, he was only digging himself deeper into a hole. One smug remark at a time. The clash that was coming wasn't just inevitably, was going to be explosive. The air inside the courtroom had changed. It was subtle, but everyone could feel it. The easy hum of legal back and forth had shifted into something sharper, heavier. Officer Daniel Briggs sat in the witness chair, still carrying that same confident posture. But now there was a faint glimmer in his eyes, a challenge. Judge Margaret Hayes had been patient. She had allowed the questioning to continue despite Daniel's interruptions, the smug remarks, and the unnecessary commentary. But patience, even for a judge of her experience, had limits. And Daniel was getting dangerously close to finding them. She leaned slightly forward on the bench, adjusting her glasses as she addressed him. "Officer Briggs," she said, her tone steady but edged with warning. "In this courtroom, answers should be direct and respectful. Please remember that." "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel replied. But again, his voice carried that same undertone, like a student reluctantly agreeing with a teacher he thought he could outsmart. The defense attorney continued her questioning. And Daniel, instead of simply responding, began offering long-winded answers that wandered into territory no one had asked about. It was clear he was using his time on the stand to lecture, to reinforce his authority, to show the jury that he was the one in control of the facts. When the attorney tried to redirect him, he smirked and said, "Well, if I can explain it my way, maybe you'll understand better." A murmur passed through the courtroom. That was the moment when even the people in the gallery, spectators, reporters, and a few lawyers waiting for their own cases, realized Daniel wasn't just confident. He was openly disrespecting the entire process. The judge's gavel tapped lightly once, not a loud crack, not yet. Just a reminder. "Officer Briggs," she said, her voice lower now, almost calm enough to hide the warning beneath it. "This is not your platform to instruct counsel. Stick to the questions asked." Daniel gave a brief nod, but when the defense attorney posed the next question, he started with all due respect, a phrase that, from his mouth, sounded like anything but respect. The judge's eyes sharpened. She set her pen down. "Officer Briggs, I will remind you once more. This is my courtroom. You will follow the rules of my courtroom. Is that understood?" Her tone had changed. The calm was still there, but it was the kind of calm that comes right before a storm. The jurors sat a little straighter. The defense attorney's expression was unreadable, but her eyes flickered with recognition. She knew this was the warning shot before the explosion. Daniel, still blind to the shift, replied, "Understood, Your Honor," but it was delivered with the faintest trace of a grin, as if he believed the rules were merely suggestions for everyone else. From that moment, The judge's patience became something visibly you could almost see it. Like a tight thread stretching thinner with each word Daniel spoke. And in that quiet, controlled way that seasoned judges mastered, she began keeping closer track of his tone, his body language, and his every interruption. People in the gallery exchanged looks. They didn't need to be lawyers to know what was coming. A confrontation between these two personalities was inevitable, and when it happened, it wasn't going to be subtle. The rookie officer thought he was handling himself just fine, holding his ground, showing strength. But he didn't realize that every smirk, every sarcastic remark, every unnecessary dig at the attorneys was no longer just a nuisance. It was becoming contempt. And in Judge Hayes's courtroom, contempt was not something you walked away from. Without consequences, the air was thick now, not with words, but with anticipation. Even the ticking of the courtroom clock seemed louder. Somewhere in the back of the room, a reporter's pen hovered above the page, ready to capture whatever happened next. And soon, Daniel Briggs was going to find out exactly how far a judge's authority could reach. The tension in the courtroom had grown so thick, it felt as though even the air refused to move. The jurors sat in stiff silence, their eyes darting between the defense attorney, the young officer on the stand, and the imposing figure of Judge Margaret Hayes. Every person in the gallery could feel it. The rookie was about to push too far. The defense attorney adjusted her glasses and leaned on the podium. Her tone was calm but firm. "Officer Briggs, just to clarify, you detained my client before verifying the exact suspect description. Is that correct?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't like the way she phrased the question, as if she were cornering him. Instead of simply answering, he leaned forward and said, "No, that's not correct. And I think you're misrepresenting the situation. Because you weren't there. I was. So maybe I should walk you through how a real arrest works." The words hung in the air for half a second, like the moment before a lightning strike. Judge Hayes's gavel came down sharply this time, the crack echoing off the walls. "Officer Briggs," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You will not speak to counsel in that manner again." But Daniel wasn't done. He raised his hand slightly in mock surrender, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm just saying, Your Honor, if people understood what it's like on the street, they wouldn't keep questioning the split-second decisions we make." A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere in the back of the room. The statement wasn't just offensive, it was confrontational. And worse, it was aimed squarely at undermining the authority of the court. The judge's voice deepened. "Officer Briggs, this is not a forum for you to challenge this court's process. You are here to testify, not to give speeches. Answer the questions you are asked, nothing more." Instead of taking the warning, Daniel's pride flared, straightened his back, and spoke with deliberate boldness. "With respect, Your Honor, I think it's important for the jury to hear the full truth, even if it makes certain people uncomfortable." The room froze. Certain people. It wasn't clear whether he meant the defense, the jury, or even the judge herself, but the implication was enough to make the temperature in the room drop. Judge Hayes set her pen down slowly, her expression unreadable. But her stillness was more intimidating than any outburst could have been. "Officer Briggs," she said quietly, "you will not imply bias in this courtroom. This is your final warning. Do you understand me?" Daniel's smirk faded just a little, but not enough. "I understand," he replied, though his tone still carried that trace of defiance that everyone in the room could hear. The defense attorney, sensing the shift, pressed forward. "Officer Briggs, were you aware that my clients had already provided identification and proof of residence before you placed him in handcuffs?" Daniel's voice sharpened. "I was aware, and I also knew enough to act before something worse happened. That's called doing my job." He glanced briefly toward the judge as he said it. almost as if daring her to correct him. That glance, that challenge, was the final straw. Judge Hayes picked up her gavel again. Not to tap it this time, but to bring the proceedings to a halt. "Bailiff," she said firmly, "remove the jury from the courtroom." Her tone was so controlled that it sent a ripple of unease through the room. The jurors filed out quietly, their eyes wide. They didn't know exactly what was about to happen, but they could sense it was something big. When the last juror had left, the judge leaned forward, her gaze fixed on Daniel Briggs. "Officer Briggs, you are dangerously close to being held in contempt of court. This is my last time explaining this to you. You are not above this court. You are not above the law, and you will not disrespect these proceedings again. If you do, you will be removed from this witness stand immediately. Am I clear?" Her voice carried the weight of the entire judicial system behind it. Daniel swallowed. And for the first time since entering the courtroom, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He gave a short nod. "Yes, Your Honor," but deep down, part of him still thought he could handle her. And that part was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. The silence in the courtroom, after Judge Hayes's warning, was so complete that even the faint ticking of the wall clock seemed louder. Daniel Briggs sat on the witness stand, his jaw tight, his back rigid, and his pride still burning under his uniform. For a moment, it looked as if the warning had settled him, but anyone paying close attention, especially the judge, could see it in his eyes. The fight wasn't over. The defense attorney returned to her podium, flipping to a fresh page of notes. "Officer Briggs," she began carefully, "you've testified that you acted to prevent a possible crime. Can you explain why you ignored your own department's de-escalation protocols in doing so?" That question was a loaded one. The courtroom seemed to lean in as they waited for his response. Daniel gave a short laugh, not loud, but enough to send a ripple of disbelief through the room. "Because," he said, his voice edged with impatience, "when you're in a real-world situation, those protocols don't always apply. Sometimes you have to use your instincts." The defense attorney pressed. "So you knowingly bypassed the law you swore to uphold?" His tone sharpened. "I upheld the law by making sure the streets were safe. Something you probably wouldn't understand sitting behind a desk." A gasp escaped from the gallery. That wasn't just arrogance, that was a direct insult to the legal process and, by extension, to everyone in the room. Judge Hayes's gavel came down hard. "Officer Briggs, that is enough," she said, her voice firm, reverberating off the courtroom walls. "You will answer questions respectfully, or you will answer them from a holding cell. Do I make myself clear?" But Daniel was too far gone to back down. He raised his chin slightly and, with an almost casual shrug, muttered, "I'm just telling the truth." The judge's eyes locked onto him. There was no anger in her expression, only a calm, dangerous authority that spoke louder than any shout could. She turned to the bailiff. "Remove the witness from the stand." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. The bailiff stepped forward, his heavy footsteps echoing as he approached. Daniel blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Wait, what? I'm not done testifying." Judge Hayes didn't flinch. "You're done for today. You've shown a blatant disregard for this court's authority and the principles of proper testimony. This hearing will recess while I consider contempt charges against you." Daniel's face flushed, his voice rising in protest. "You can't just—" "I can, and I will," Judge Hayes interrupted, her tone razor-sharp. "Because this is my courtroom. And in my courtroom, respect is not optional, it is required." The bailiff's hand came to rest firmly on Daniel's arm, guiding him away from the stand. The young officer resisted for half a second, but the weight of the moment and the collective stares of everyone in the room seemed to press him down. The jurors, now watching from a distance through the open doorway, looked stunned. reporters, scribbled furiously, their pens scratching across the pages like tiny hammers recording history. Daniel glanced back over his shoulder as he was led away, but Judge Hayes didn't meet his eyes. She was already reviewing her notes, the picture of composure. To her, this wasn't a personal victory, it was a necessary act to protect the integrity of the court. In that moment, the rookie learned something the hard way. A badge might carry authority on the street, but in a courtroom, it is the judge's gavel that holds the final word, and for the first time since he'd walked in that morning, Daniel Briggs was no longer the most confident man in the room. The clang of the heavy courtroom doors closing behind him felt louder than any sound. Daniel Briggs had heard that day. As the bailiff released his arm in the hallway, the young officer straightened his uniform and tried to shake off the sting of what had just happened. But no amount of squared shoulders or deep breaths could erase the fact that he had been escorted out of a courtroom by order of a judge in front of a jury, reporters, and his fellow officers. Whispers followed him as he walked down the hall. Court staff exchanged quick glances. Lawyers passing by gave him the kind of look usually reserved for rookies who'd just stepped into something far bigger than they understood. It wasn't sympathy in their eyes, it was recognition. They had all seen it before, someone so sure of their own authority that they forgot where it ends. By the time Daniel returned to the police department later that day, word had already spread. The moment he stepped into the squad room, the chatter dimmed. A few officers nodded at him cautiously, but most kept their eyes on their work. His sergeant called him into the office almost immediately. The conversation was short and cold. The sergeant explained that the department had received a formal notice from the court about Daniel's behavior. There would be an internal review. Until then, he was being placed on desk duty, no patrols, no arrests, no courtroom appearances. For a rookie eager to prove himself, it was a quiet but crushing blow. Daniel tried to defend himself. "I was just telling the truth," he said, the same words he'd used in the courtroom. But the sergeant leaned forward, his voice low and hard. "The truth doesn't matter if no one will listen to you because you've disrespected the process. You made it about you. That's not how this works, Briggs." It wasn't just his fellow officers he had to worry about. The local news picked up the story that evening, framing it as rookie officer removed from courtroom after defying judge. Clips from inside the courthouse, silent but damning, played on the screen. Daniel smirking on the stand, leaning forward, talking over the attorney the moment the bailiff approached. On social media, the incident blew up. Some people criticized the officer for arrogance and disrespect, while others accused the judge of being too strict. The debate quickly moved beyond just Daniel and Judge Hayes, became a talking point about race, power, and accountability in the justice system. Commentators dissected every moment, analyzing body language and tone as if it were a televised trial. Daniel's phone buzzed constantly. Friends texted to ask what happened, some offering support, others hinting he might have gone too far. A few calls from family members were harder to hear. They didn't sound angry, just disappointed. Meanwhile, Judge Hayes made no public comment. She didn't need to. Her authority wasn't defended in interviews, it was defended in the moment. It mattered most in her courtroom. Within days, Daniel was summoned to a meeting with the department's internal affairs unit. The questions were pointed. Had he been coached on courtroom conduct? Did he understand the consequences of contempt? Did he realize the public image of the department had been damaged? For the first time, Daniel didn't have quick, confident answers. The reality of his situation was settling in like a heavy weight. His badge, his uniform, his status, none of it had protected him from the fallout. And in the background, a hearing date loomed. Judge Hayes had not yet announced whether she would pursue contempt charges, but the possibility hung over him like a storm cloud. He had thought the day in court would be about proving himself as an officer. Instead, it had become a lesson he hadn't wanted and one he would never forget. Weeks passed before Officer Daniel Briggs set foot in a courthouse again. The suspension from active duty had felt like an eternity, every day spent behind a desk instead of out on the streets. His once confident stride had quieted into something slower, more measured. The incident with Judge Hayes had replayed in his mind more times than he could count, each memory sharper than the last. The contempt hearing had been scheduled, but before it could take place, Daniel's attorney advised him to issue a formal apology. At first, the idea made him bristle. Why should he apologize for telling the truth? But as the days wore on, the weight of isolation inside the department, the cool glances from colleagues, and the endless public chatter began to sink. The truth wasn't that he'd stood up for himself. It was that he'd let his pride speak louder than his duty. When the day finally came, Daniel walked into the same courtroom where everything had gone wrong. This time, there was no swagger in his step, no smirk on his face. The benches were sparsely filled, but among the few spectators were a couple of reporters, still eager to see what the rookie officer would do next. Judge Hayes sat at the bench, her expression calm, as if the entire episode weeks ago had been nothing more than another case in a long career. But Daniel knew better. She remembered everything. When called forward, Hayes stood straight but not stiff, and his voice, though steady, carried a humility that hadn't been there before. "Your Honor," he began, "I want to acknowledge my behavior during my last appearance here. I spoke out of turn. I disrespected the rules of this court, and, in doing so, I disrespected you, the attorneys, and the process itself. I was wrong." A hush settled over the room. Even the court clerk paused in their typing to glance up. Daniel went on, "Wearing a badge gave me authority on the street, but I confused that with authority everywhere. I thought I was standing my ground, but really, I was just letting my ego take over. I understand now that the law doesn't belong to one person, it belongs to the system. And the system only works if we all respect it." Judge Hayes studied him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she spoke, her voice carrying the same steady weight it had the day she ordered him removed. "Officer Briggs, this court accepts your apology. Contempt charges will not be pursued, but let this be the last time you mistake authority for license. The badge you wear is a responsibility, not a shield." Daniel nodded, the words settling deeper than any punishment could have. "Yes, Your Honor." The hearing ended quickly after that, but the moment stayed with him. Walking out of the courthouse, he didn't feel victorious, and he didn't feel defeated. He felt changed. The arrogance that had once fueled his every step had been replaced with something far more valuable: perspective. Back at the precinct, few officers gave him a nod, not the cautious nods from before, but ones that carried a quiet sense of acknowledgement. They knew he'd been through something that would either make or break a young cop. Months later, Daniel would find himself testifying again, this time in front of another judge. He spoke with confidence, but also with restraint. He answered questions directly, never interrupting, never letting his pride tip into disrespect. And those who had been in the room that first time, those who had seen him escorted out, were stunned at the difference. For Daniel Briggs, the lesson was simple but lasting. In the streets, a badge can command obedience, but in a courtroom, respect is earned word by word. And no one, not even the most confident rookie, is above the gavel.